I.I.Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 2, Part 2, Slavuta Gross-infirmary, read by Natalia Bysova. The train with the wounded left Petigorsk at night. It was accompanied by SS men and an auxiliary group of policemen. The first obviously carried out security, and the second watching over us on the way. No doctor or nurse was seen on the train. There were very serious patients among us. Some of them could not survive on the way, but the dead were not carried out of the carriages to the final stop. The policemen had their own separate carriage, but at stops each of them checked their sponsor, in which they appointed the headman, and the attendants counted us, gave the order to take out the night buckets and collect water. Then they put us in the carriages like herring in a barrel. We lay close to each other, however, not on bare boards, but on hospital mattresses. That eased the suffering of those who were seriously injured, especially bone skeletal. And yet, when the carriages twitched, moving away, or suddenly stopped, clattering with buffers, these unfortunate people cried out, sending a curse both to the train driver and to Hitler himself. The atmosphere in the carriage was depressing. Screams and groans did not subside. Ominous predictions were made of where they were taking us and what would happen to us. I could not sleep for a long time. I was thinking about how tragical my mediocre fate was. Instead of lieutenant's uniform and frontline exploits, which were dreamed of in the school, I ended up in captivity and rode in a bad carriage, disfigured, helpless, and miserable. Again and again, I went over in my memory all my steps and deeds on that fateful night. Where had I gone wrong? How could I have fallen into the hands of the enemy? After all, I had been such a guy that it seemed that the bullet would not catch up. We drove for almost 2 days. It was dark and stench in the carriage like in a dead house. The train often stopped, but the door would open 3 or 4 times during the entire trip. They carried the buckets, took water, and moved on. The first long stop was, it seems, at the Tikhoretskaya station. There, local Cossack women literally attacked the train. They shouted the names of the husbands, brothers, sons, asking if they were among us, threw bread, food, apples at the open door, and the Germans and policemen drove them away from the carriages and even beat some. After that, the door was no longer opened in crowded places. Finally, on October the 22nd, at lunchtime, we were brought to our destination. The train stopped 10-15 kilometers from the town of Slavuta, Kamenets-Podolsk, now Khmelnytsky region. Before the war, a cavalry corps had been stationed there, surrounded by dense forests, and then the Germans brought wounded prisoners of war there from everywhere. The door of the carriages opened, and prisoners of war orderlies with stretchers in their hands reached out to it from the camp. They were accompanied by Germans with dogs on leashes. Unloading began. When my turn came, the orderlies put me on a stretcher and carried me to the camp, surrounded by a barbed wire. There were large 3-story houses, also walled off. Watch towers were visible around the camp. My mood was depressing. What I had already heard about the Nazi concentration camps came true. And when in the corridor through which they carried me, I noticed mucus on the stone walls and streaks on the side walls as in a real dungeon, I thought, they're taking me into the grave. The barracks were large, with squads which at one time apparently were designed for squadrons, that is, for 150, 200 people. Now, in each of them, up to 300 crippled people were laid. In the entire three-story building, there were 6 such departments, 2 per floor. Consequently, about 2,000 wounded were accommodated. If there were 12 in the camp, then there would be about 20,000 prisoners. Each building was called a block. I was brought into block 3 and laid on the lower part of the bunks. It is difficult to convey the first impression of barracks crowded with either people or their otherworldly shadows. The faces were thin, dry, pale acid. Eyes were puffy, lacking vitality. They only had a dull hopelessness. Thoughts from the outside were not visible, but soon they would come to me. Every day and every minute they would drill the brain with the same bore: food. In a few days, the new arrivals would exchange their good quality tunics and riding breeches for worn-out rags for a ration of bread and become the same goners as everyone else. And their good things would go through the orderlies to the policemen, then through the wire to the Cossacks, who, together with the Germans, guarded the camp, and those would mainly exchange them for bacon and moonshine. They put me on a bare bunk. Our mattresses had remained in the carriages, and we never saw them again. Such goods came from the front line zones alone with the prisoners rarely, and were taken by the Germans, Cossacks, and policemen. The bunks were made from not planed boards, but already wiped out by my predecessors. On my personal belongings, I still had a short soldier's overcoat. It was both for lying on and covering with. And under my head, I put a bag with a pair of linen, which had been given in the hospital. I also had an aluminum bowl and a spoon. Later, I got an overcoat and a pot from the dead neighbor. The old-timers of the barracks immediately came to us, the newcomers. They asked what was happening on the fronts, who we were, where we fought, and where we were from. And some already offered crutches or crutches for the ration of bread. They talked about themselves and about the internal daily routine, what to watch out for and whom to fear, how they are fed and what they sell, what is exchanged. On the same day, we were registered: surname, nationality, place of birth, where and in what rank and position we served. That was the only time during my entire stay in different camps. Nobody else wrote any information about us anywhere else. The camp number was given, and even then, not everywhere. I have already forgotten my first neighbors on the bunk, because they often changed. Some died, and those whose wounds were healed were transferred to disabled units, or working teams were formed from them and sent somewhere. But one Mingrelian by nationality from Georgia has been remembered for a long time. When I first saw him, I involuntarily flinched. He was missing both ankle feet. Either frostbitten or a mine tore them off. He lay on a bunk, face up, and spoke deliriously, pressing his knees to his stomach and shaking his naked, rotten stumps above him. And worms swamped over them. Something monotonous and plaintive escaped from his mouth. Ah, va, 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 ah, va, va. Gangrene killed him that very night. Later, I saw similar and maybe even more terrible dead people at every step. Gradually, I got used to them and no longer shuddered when they were seized by a dying convulsion. when they, like firewood, were thrown onto carts and transported to suburban ditches. I never saw such a death camp as the Slavuta Gross-infirmary. People died like flies from hunger, wounds, and disease. Every morning, 15-20 corpses were taken out from our block. The mortality rate was even higher in the first typhoid and in the second infectious block, with almost 100% deaths. The camp was called the infirmary probably because seriously wounded prisoners were brought there from all France, but no one treated them, although in each unit there were 2-3 doctors or paramedics from among the same prisoners who themselves had recovered from their own wounds. They occasionally examined us and helped with some advice, and the role of the orderlies was limited to the fact that they washed the floor, delivered gruel, and served buckets to those who could not get to the toilet themselves, as well as accommodate new arrivals and take out the dead. The regime was maintained by swearing and beatings. Each department was headed by a headman. That was a confidant of the head of the unit, who was already a police representative. The power of the headman was unlimited. That position was held by a young Ossetian, a former senior cavalry lieutenant. Both the orderlies and the sick were afraid of him. He came into the barracks and looked closely at what to find fault with in order to use a rubber stick, which he never parted with. The sick and individual orderlies suffered mostly. Someone from weakness urinated under himself or did not reach the toilet, then he earned cuffs. The Germans did not enter the barracks. Obviously, they were afraid to get infected. Doctors and orderlies lived in separate rooms, sleeping on iron beds with mattresses. They got better and more food. They were dressed in decent uniforms from someone else's shoulder that did not seem to fit at all. Everything in the camp was valued for bread and cigarettes. There was also some Ukrainian money. Each block occupied an area of 1.5 hectares. Walking patients walked along it. It was forbidden to approach the outer wire fence. The sentry German from the tower could kill with the machine gun, and between the towers, armed Cossacks walked over the wire fence. Brisk trade was going on between neighboring blocks through the wire almost all day. What was not there? Bread in rations and halves was exchanged for cigarettes, homemade and factory pots, spoons, crutches, clothes and shoes, cigarette cases, cigarette holders, pipes, armchairs, needles, awls, hammers, threads, buttons, knives, mirrors, and carnations were sold. And everything was made with the homemade method, with bare hands, practically out of nothing. If you got a wire, it meant there would be needles, sewing machines, knives. There was an iron gate between the blocks, near which police officers were on duty. At night, the gates were locked, as well as the doors of the buildings. During the day, muggy policemen with rubber sticks walked from block to block, but they had no weapons. They were recruited from among the prisoners of war who improved their health and agreed to serve the Germans. They were hated in the camp because it was not so much the Germans as them who beat prisoners for the slightest guilt or disobedience. And outside, the protection of the territory was carried on mainly by the Cossacks. Among them were the former Krasnov and newly appeared werewolves. In our block, as well as in the neighboring one, the 5th and the 6th, they were seriously wounded, and I did not see prisoners beaten by the police because they did not enter the barracks. But in other blocks, where the prisoners themselves received gruel, brought from the kitchen in large barrels, they were beaten to death for trying to ask for more or to queue a second time with an empty pot. In general, our troops were worse than the Germans. The most pressing problem was nutrition. They gave us food twice a day. In the morning at 10 o'clock, the orderlies carried a loaf of bread for 4 people and a liter of boiling water without sugar. What this bread was made of is hard to say. Maybe a mixture of corn and bran, because it could barely keep its shape. We cut that bread first into 2 equal parts and then each half into 2 more, each 300 grams. And we had the scales, a small rocker, 20-30 centimeters long, intercepted with a rope exactly in the middle, so that someone could hold it in his hand, and at both ends of the rocker pegs hung down on strings, which plumped into grain particles. They were weighed in such a way that they were equal. Then one of us turned away, and the other, pointing his finger at each ration, asked, "To whom?" And the one who had turned away called our names or surnames in turn. We cut the bread and guessed it in turn. Such a democracy excluded any injustice. In general, rationing bread in captivity is life. Stealing it from a neighbor or taking it away from a weak person was the biggest crime for which you could immediately be beaten to death. At lunchtime, at 3 or 4 o'clock, the orderlies brought a smoking tank into the barracks, collected our pots, and poured 1 liter gruel into them. It looked like a lean goulash, but not with millet, but with unpeeled magara, similar to millet, only smaller than it. Potato husks were also encountered. There was no talk about fat filling. They just gave us some kind of hot slop, only salted. The potatoes might have stood out a little, but they obviously ended up in the service boiler, and we only got the husks. Unshelled magara was not digested in the stomach. Mass diarrhea began. Mortality increased, and after a while, instead of magara, they began to cook gruel with unpeeled potatoes and beetroots. But this did not save us from hunger. It was especially hard for men, stout, physically healthy. They picked knotweed under the wire and ate it raw, rinsing it in cold water. However, they were swollen, could not get up from the bunk, went for a pee in bed, and died. People looked like skeletons, covered with pale, earthy skin, without calves on their legs and biceps on their arms, and empty capsules hung from behind instead of buttocks. We were a little lucky. We were brought to this infirmary already at the end of the Magara season. Besides, I was thin and endured it easier. Another problem bothered me, sanitary and hygienic one. The underwear was not changed. Who could? He himself washed underwear in a wash basin at least once every 2-3 months. There was probably a bathhouse in the camp, but not for us. The clothes were not heated, so there were a lot of lice. You took off your shirt or underpants, took a splinter in your hands, and scooped them up from behind each scar in a heap to crush together. And in a few days, more of them would breed there. In winter, an epidemic of typhus broke out. The patients were sent to Block 1, and from there was only one road, to the ditches. It was my turn too. The appetite disappeared and the fever began. The paramedic looked into my mouth, looked at my tongue, and waved his hand. The orderlies put me on a stretcher and carried me to the typhoid block. They threw me on the bunk and left. I looked around and felt terrible in my soul. On the bunks, there were lying dead and alive corpses of no use to anyone. Some were still moving, others were lying unconscious and breathing heavily, and still others were dead. It was the most vacant, at the same time terrible block. No one from the authorities came there steering clear of it. However, there also were their own superiors, the headmen, medical assistants, orderlies from among those who had already had typhoid fever. One of them, Petro Shenheri, turned out to be my fellow countryman from the neighboring village of Yahniki. That meeting saved me from a seemingly inevitable death. On the most difficult 3 or 4 days, when I was lying almost unconscious, he brought pea soup from the cauldron for the attendants and fed me from a spoon. And when I began to recover, he supported me with some food products. Subsequently, he got me real crunches, apparently somebody's who had died, and then he helped to remove the plaster cast from my leg with a lot of lice behind it. For the first time since the injury, I saw my crippled heel, swollen and blue, with 2 large lingering scars. The entire lower leg from knee to foot was thin, like a stick without calves. With the advice of a paramedic, I began to walk on crutches, gradually stepping on my wounded leg. I had to wait it. When I was already a little stronger, Petro began to bring me mahorka to sell for Ukrainian money at interblock bazaars. Where he got it, I don't know. Perhaps he received from the police or exchanged for clothes from those who had died from typhoid. But I can consciously or conscientiously carried out that order, and every evening I ate a liter of normal soup with potatoes and cereals for that. He also brought slices of bread. I lived relatively well around him. I was not hungry, gained some strength, and already walked on crutches quickly and confidently. Later, at the beginning of the summer, I sold my crutches and bought myself a walking stick. Although my leg hurt, I put more and more weight on it. Somewhere in the spring or early summer, an extraordinary event took place in the camp. A group of doctors and orderlies, former commanders, escaped by digging under a wire from their room. For 6 months, they had been digging a tunnel and quietly carried the S out into the yard under the guise of garbage. They had dug probably more than 100 meters and at night fled to the surrounding forest to the partisans. There was a great commotion in the camp. The Germans and policemen checked all the premises, checked up the attendants as well as the prisoners, planting a mole among them. Some of the orderlies were sent to work camps. Petros and Harry also had to leave. I was left without trade and food support. But he survived and returned to his homeland in 1945. However, he didn't get home. Instead, he was forced to move to the Taiga for 8 years for his stay in war captivity. And after Stalin's death, he broke free and came to his native village. He worked on a collective farm. I went to visit him several times, and he was at my place on holidays. And back to the camp. We, the prisoners, were also sorted out. As a recovered person, I was transferred to the disabled in Block 9. And again, I was on dull, hungry vegetation. However, the Magara ration was not repeated. Either the Battle of Stalingrad influenced the situation, or prisoners were all diminishing because replenishment from the France did not come as before. But they began to give us normal bread and gruel with potatoes and beetroots. The most difficult period was already over. In 1941-42, prisoners died from hunger, wounds, and diseases in endless thousands. They were also mercilessly beaten and shot. And after Stalingrad, the situation began to change for the better. The flow of echelons with prisoners dropped sharply. For the first time, the ghost of retribution for the committed crimes loomed over the fascists, so some of them began to soften a little. The police also became quiet. Some of them, covering their tracks up, tried to get into work teams or other camps. The moral situation in the barracks also changed. At night, it was impossible to fall asleep because of the painfully biting bugs. But they were afraid of the light, and we gathered under a single light bulb in the center of the barracks, where there were always heated discussions on the topic of the day. If earlier some people had openly scolded Stalin for collectivization and dispossession of wealthier peasants, for executions and friendship with Hitler, best out that the Ukrainians would soon be allowed home and even given land, now the talk was mainly about the possible defeat of the Germans and the end of the war. Although among us, the wounded, there were no those who had voluntarily surrendered to captivity, still fierce anti-Sovietists and candidates for German lackeys did happen. I remember being in the third block. I was at loggerheads with one of them. He argued that the Germans would dissolve the collective farms and every Ukrainian would be given land. From the Germans, you will receive no more than 2 meters of land, in which they will put you as soon as you die. I cut him off and nobbled over to my bunk. Stalin is bastard, he said. Today I admit that that label had some kind of my spiritual content then. Although I defended not Stalin, but my patriotic positions. My attitude towards Stalin has always been contradictory and not completely determined, because I was formed among the people who had suffered the most from Stalin and at the same time applauded him. I've never forgotten my uncle's talk that Lenin gave the land to the peasants and Stalin took it away and sent the best farmers to Solovki. I don't know if there was any underground group in the camp, but the next day, a man of about 45 sat down next to me, holding a stick and limping. He greeted me and began to talk about this and that, asking who I was, where I came from, where I had served, how I was taken prisoner. And then he said, I noticed yesterday how you gave the brush to that lackey. You should not do it this way. There may be informers between us. Be careful, or you will end up badly. After that, I bit my tongue a little. Despite the fact that we were literally behind 7 locks under reliable protection, frontline news reached us. It was brought mainly by newly arrived wounded from the trains. They also penetrated through the policemen and Cossacks, among whom were various people, obvious enemies and sympathizers with us. Ukrainian newspapers also fell into our hands. Although they were anti-Bolshevik and anti-Russian, one could guess from the tone of individual articles that a new offensive stage in the war began after Stalingrad. And when the Battle of Kursk ended, we already knew that our army was approaching the Dnieper. Once a newspaper published an advertisement that the Kopak gang was making its way to the west through the Slavuta forests. His features were given: a gypsy with a beard, and mustache, of average height, about 50 years old. Those who detained the Bolshevik bandit were promised a considerable reward. Its sum has disappeared from my memory. But it is interesting that Kopak was called a gypsy, a bandit, and a horse thief in order to cause hostility among the population. But we knew that they were partisans. We even waited with the hope of a possible attack on the camp in order to go to the woods. From time to time, the camp was visited by experts on Jews and commissars. Then we were all stripped naked, lined up in one line and carefully examined. If the penis was circumcised, it meant Jew. The commissars were singled out mainly for the gold teeth in the mouth. All of them were taken away and no one else saw them. Sometimes the Vlasovites appeared in a German uniform with the sleeve insignia ROA, Russian Liberation Army. Stalin and many of his comrades in arms, like Kaganovich, accused the Ukrainian people of various sabotages, bread-giving, collectivization, then of loyalty to the fascist invaders, or of armed resistance, the Banderites in Western Ukrainian lands. But hundreds of thousands of Russians fought against the Stalinist regime in the ranks of Vlasov's army. The Vlasovites campaigned for the full recovery to join their ranks. I don't know what the results were, because they didn't come to us, disabled people. I think that only a few could voluntarily go to them, those who wanted to get even with the Stalinist system for repression, and some in that way risked in order to escape from starvation, hoping to move at the right moment to their own army. But their own path could not lead to the desired goal. When they crossed the front line or surrendered, the own army did not ask them about their intentions, but shot them on the spot. The fall of 1943 was approaching. The battles were already going on the Dnieper. They began to cut our hair, wash, heat our clothes, give prophylactic injections against various diseases, and load us into trains to be sent further to the rear. At least once we got to the bus house. The Germans obviously were afraid to take our thoroughbred lice to their Reich with us. At the end of October, our block also got into the next echelon without waiting for liberation. I had been in the Slavuta Gross-infirmary for exactly 1 year. It was both frightening for me and at the same time somewhat condescending. I was not destined to fall into suburban ditches. I was starving, but I did not stoop to the level of a lost goner. I always washed myself, did not eat grass, did not smoke for my ration of bread, and did not pounce on the half-eaten gruel of a dead neighbor. But I stubbornly clung to life, and the belief that I would survive never left me. In some ways, I was lucky. First of all, I was taken prisoner not in 1941, but in 1942, when the flywheel of death was turning a little slower. I was lucky that I met my fellow countryman Petroshin Harry there. I am also grateful that I was thin and could live on the most meager food. Each of us dreamed of home as a close but unattainable paradise, wanting to somehow send a message about himself. But he could not carry out his intention. And there was not a single case that any of the relatives found out about their son, husband, or brother. In any case, I have not heard of such a miracle. We were imprisoned in hell, the door of which was tightly closed. One evening before the evening, I got under the bench in front of the block and lying on my back began to slash my home address. I was already finishing when I heard the barking of shepherds. That was a German sentry with 2 policemen who locked our blocks for the night. I hastily finished my last name, first name, and patronymic and nobbled into the barrack. And the dogs were already running. After the bedtime signal, they could tear apart the one who got lost on the street. Imagine my surprise when, having arrived home in 1945, I found a letter to my mother from Sergeant Mykola Shevchenko, a native of the Gadych district, who had written from the front that he was liberating the Slavuta camp and saw my name and home address on a dumped bench. So my family knew that I was in captivity, waited for the end of the war, and hoped for my return home. I immediately wrote a letter of thanks to the sergeant at his home address. Parents replied that Mykola had not returned from the war. I don't know if the Germans had time to take everyone to the rear, or if they left some, in particular the infectious units, or maybe they shot the infirm. At the Nuremberg trials, as well as in the press after the war, the death infirmary was mentioned more than once. I read that a monument to the martyrs of the camp had been erected there, and that there were meetings with the surviving prisoners, but I didn't go there. I don't like our politicized meetings. They have something fake and dishonest. They are used as a rule for ideological purposes to glorify the regime that actually abandoned us, enrolling in the category of traitors, as well as for self-promotion of those in power. You will listen to them, how they are worried about the fallen and the missing, and you involuntarily remember prisons and logging, persecution and discrimination for those who, in spite of all deaths, survived, returned from Hitler's camps, and ended up in Stalin's. If I manage to visit that terrible cemetery, then, taking off my hat, I will quietly go around it, stand silently near the former ditches, or maybe I will fall on my knees and cry, but so that no one can see.